to oversee the meeting, and I've got the official Charles Lamb Society gavel to declare this meeting open. John, over to you.
Thank you very much, Felicity. Welcome everybody. Happy St. George's Day, Shakespeare's birthday, death day, Wordsworth, 172 years since Wordsworth died on the 23rd of April. You're all most welcome. I'm absolutely delighted to introduce our Elian reader, and today it's David Stewart from the University of Northumbria. So David, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you. So from newspapers 35 years ago, first published under a different title in the Englishman's magazine in 1831. It is soothing to contemplate the head of the Ganges, to trace the first little bubblings of a mighty river, with holy reverence to approach the rocks whence glide the streams renowned in ancient song, fired with a perusal of the Abyssinian pilgrims' exploratory ramblings after the cradle of the infant Nihilus. We well remember on one fine summer holiday, a whole day's leave, we called it, at Christ's Hospital, sallying forth at rise of sun, not very well provisioned either for such an undertaking, to trace the current of the new river, Middletonian stream, to its scaturient source, as we had read in Meadows by fair Amwell. Gallantly did we commence our solitary quest, for it was essential to the dignity of our discovery that no eye of schoolboy save our own should beam on the detection. By flowery spots and verdant lanes skirting Hornsey, hope trained us on many a baffling turn, endless, hopeless meanders as it seemed, or as if the jealous waters had dodged us, reluctant to have the humble spot of their nativity revealed, till spent and nigh famished before set of the same sun, we sat down somewhere by Bowes Farm near Tottenham, with a tithe of our proposed labours only yet accomplished, sorely convinced in spirit that that Brucean enterprise was as yet too arduous for our young shoulders. Not more refreshing to the thirsty curiosity of the traveller is the tracing of some mighty waters up to their shallow frontlet than it is to a pleased and candid reader to go back to the inexperienced essays, the first callow flights in authorship of some established name in literature, from the gnat which preluded to the Aeneid, to the duck which Samuel Johnson trod on. In those days, every morning paper has an essential retainer to its establishment, kept an author, who was bound to furnish daily a quantum of witty paragraphs. Sixpence a joke, and it was thought pretty high too, was Dan Stewart's settled remuneration in these cases. The chat of the day, scandal, but above all, dress, furnished the material. The length of no paragraph was to exceed 7 lines. Shorter they might be, but they must be poignant. Thanks.
Thank you very much, David. A great choice and really well read. Thank you so much. That's a great start to proceedings. Okay, I am now delighted to introduce today's lecturer, Dr. Matthew Sangster, who is Senior Lecturer in Romantic Studies, Fantasy and Cultural History at the University of Glasgow. Now, Matt has recently published an outstanding monograph, Living as an Author in the Romantic Period, which appeared last year, 2021. And he's been very busy recently because he has no fewer than 3 essay collections which are due to appear in the next 12 months. David Bowie and the Legacies of Romanticism for Romantic Circles, Institutions of Literature, 1700 to 1900, co-edited with John Mee to be published by Cambridge University Press, and Remediating the 1820s, also with Professor Mee for Edinburgh University Press. And Matt, I should say, is also currently working on 2 Arts and Humanities Research Council funded projects which explore reading history. They are Libraries, Reading Communities and Cultural Formation in the 18th Century Atlantic, which is run with the University of Liverpool, and Books and Borrowing, 1750 to 1830, an analysis of Scottish Borrowers' Register, and that is with the University of Stirling. He's also, as we know from David Stewart's recent talk, working with a crack team of Elians, John Gardner, Simon Kabezi, and David Stewart, on the new World's Classics edition of Piers Egan's novel, Life in London. Welcome, Matt. Matt's title today is Throw Yourself Rather, My Dear Sir, from the Tarpeian Rock, Writing as a Career in the Romantic Period. Over to you, Matthew, and welcome.
Thanks very much, Sean, and thanks everyone for coming. And thanks to Felicity for inviting me and for Adam for hosting. I'm going to try and share my screen and see if this is the point where things collapse or whether this will function. There you go from the beginning. Can someone just give me a quick thumbs up to let me know that that's visible? Okay, yes. Brilliant. I cannot see anything else apart from my slides while I'm doing this, so I apologize for not responding to anything in the chat, but do put things in the chat if that will be helpful, and I will pick those up at the end. So this draws on my book, but we will begin with Charles Lamb. So there'll be a kind of bridge through part of the book, and then we'll begin with Charles Lamb, and we'll get back to Charles Lamb towards the end. So in 1823, Charles Lamb was horrified when he heard the Quaker poet Bernard Barton was thinking of leaving his bank position and throwing himself into the realm of letters. Throw yourself rather, my dear sir, he wrote from the Tarpeian Rock, slap down headlong upon iron spikes. He attempted vehemently to dissuade Barton from his proposed course. If you had but 5 consolatory minutes between desk and the bed, make much of them and live a century of them rather than turn slave to the booksellers. They're Turks and Tartars when they have poor authors at their beck. Hitherto you've been at arm's length from them. Come not within their grasp. I have known many authors for bread, some repining, others envying the blessed security of a counting house, all agreeing that they had rather been tailors, weavers, whatnot, rather than the things they were. I've known some starved, some to go mad, one dear friend literally dying in a workhouse. You know not what a rapacious, dishonest set those booksellers are. Ask even Southey, who a single case almost has made a fortune by book drudgery, what he has found them. Actually, if you did ask Robert Southey, and he was disposed to answer honestly, he would have to admit that his literary career was underpinned initially by family support and then by a substantial annuity from his school friend Charles Wynne, who granted him an annuity of 160 in 1797, which was later converted to a £200 a year state pension and then supplemented by the laureateship. While Southey's writing was eventually fairly profitable, he was never entirely reliant on direct publishing profits, around half his income coming from elsewhere. He also benefited from the special arrangement he struck with John Murray, where he was paid £100 each for his contributions to the Quarterly Review, not the kind of rate that was generally available. And even so, Southey often found himself in financial difficulties. When his son Herbert died in 1816, he had to ask his friend Grosvenor Bedford to pay the funeral expenses. And as late as 1827, disruptions to his periodical incomes left him, in his words, desperately short of money. While he was happy with his own choice of career, he would have agreed with Lamb's assessment, was under no illusions about authorship being a good choice in general. In 1812, he described literature as the worst trade to which a man can possibly betake himself. As late as 1837, in the letter to Charlotte Bronte, often rebuked for attempting to check her ambitions, so he represented his own circumstances as singular and fortunate. I, who have made literature my profession and devoted my life to it, think myself nevertheless bound in duty to caution every young man who applies as an aspirant to me for encouragement and advice against taking so perilous a course. This has often been read as condescension, but reflects the reality that attempting to live by the pen in the Romantic period was an extremely risky proposition. In his letter to Barton, Lamb continues, "Oh, you know not me, you never know the miseries of subsisting by authorship. 'Tis a pretty appendage to a situation like yours or mine, but a slavery worse than all slavery to be a bookseller's dependent, to drudge your brains, pots of ale and breasts of mutton, to change your free thoughts and voluntary numbers for ungracious taskwork. Those fellows hate us. The reason I take to be that contrary to other trades in which the master gets all the credit, the jeweler or silversmith, for instance, the journeyman who really does the fine work is in the background. In our work, the world gives us all the credit, or gives all the credit to us, they consider as their journeyman, and therefore they do hate us and cheat us and oppress us and wring the blood of us out to put another sixpence in their mechanic pouches. I contend that the bookseller has a relative honesty towards authors, not like his honesty to the rest of the world." In this passage, I think Lamb is being more than a little unfair. It is certainly true that booksellers are occasionally shortchanged authors. William St. Clair has arrestingly described the accounts John Murray produced for Jane Austen's Emma as being as fictional as the novel. But low payments reflected the fact that until the 1820s, most kinds of books, including literary works, circulated as luxury items to small audiences. Examining publishers' archives shows that a decent-sized edition of 1,000 copies of a book retailing at 10 shillings might easily cost a bookseller £300 for the paper printing and advertising costs. This edition would thus only start to turn a profit once 60% of the copies were sold. Under a half profits arrangement, the publisher and author would each stand to earn about £100 if it completely sold through. Those figures are pretty typical. In my book, I went through a number of examples from the Long Murray archives in more detail. While really successful books could sell vastly more, most works, or most literary works, most poetry, most novels, never sold through their initial print runs, and low payments from booksellers thus often reflected expected returns. Knowing this makes it easier to understand why Lamb, despite his obvious affinity for literary matters, took the career path he did. He was well known for moaning about the restrictions his employment at East India House put on his time, and in writing to Barton, he described this grousing as being to a great extent performative. Henceforth, I retract all my fond complaints of mercantile employment. Look at them as lovers' quarrels. I was but half in earnest. Welcome, dead timber of a desk that makes me live. A little grumbling is a wholesome medicine for the spleen, but in my inner heart, do I approve and embrace this, our close but unharassing way of life? This letter to Barton, I think, provides a useful corrective to the view that Lamb was a frustrated author trapped in a job he hated. There were, of course, pragmatic reasons why Lamb in particular required a steady income once he was taking care of Mary, but he was also quite clear-eyed about the difficulties of seeking to position oneself in the world principally as a writer. Looking at late 18th and early 19th century sources makes it apparent that the position of author was a complicated and troubled one. Our most familiar contemporary paradigms of authorship, authors operating as artists, as professionals, or as both, were nascent in certain Romantic period works and lives, were fully reified only in the mid to late 19th century and significantly reconfigured during the 20th and 21st centuries. In this talk, then, I'd like first to discuss the tensions surrounding authorship in the Romantic period, drawing on the introduction of my book, Living as an Author in the Romantic Period. You can see it's, I think, rather handsome cover here. There's also this discount code, which makes it from eye-wateringly expensive down to only very, very expensive indeed. I will put this up again at the end if anyone's interested. It is probably a book that, until it comes out in paperback, hopefully soon will be mainly bought by libraries. Although it is a book I'm very happy with, and I think there's plenty of good stuff in there. Once I've talked about authorship in general, I'll turn back to Lamb to talk specifically about his career, arguing that while he wasn't always fortunate in the way his decisions turned out, the choices he made display a pretty canny sense of the right way to manage the literary aspect of one's self-fashioning in the period he was writing. So as Lamb's letter to Barton accurately depicts, living by the pen in the Romantic period was a dangerous proposition, and especially so for those without established social networks and advantages. In modern discourse, we allow for a relatively strong conceptual separation between what a text expresses and its author's real opinion. The late 18th and early 19th century literary works were commonly read more straightforwardly as their writers' voices. Books existed in tight metonymic relationships with their authors. Those by living writers were commonly seen as aspects of beings who could be encountered, befriended, or opposed. This mode of apprehension reflected the status of writing within a literate class that was kept relatively small by economic factors, within which professionalizing discourses that placed buffers between text and authors had yet to take hold. In this highly politicized environment, intention was a basic assumption rather than a fallacy. As Gregory Dart puts it, the early 19th century thought of itself as an age of personality. No period either before or since seems to have been so entirely predisposed to correlate the fates of nations and the dynamics of personal character. Writers were often read precisely because of who they were or who they purported to be, and readers' responses to books were highly mediated by their knowledge of authors. Anonymous publication was common in large part because acknowledged works were regularly employed to impugn authors' reputations. To write under one's own name was to submit oneself for judgment, a prospect that many writers found distinctly unnerving. Mary Brunton, contemplating the publication of her first novel, Self-Control, wrote to a friend in terms that make this very clear. To be pointed at, to be noticed and commented upon, to be suspected of literary airs, to be shunned as a literary runner by the more unpretending of my own sex, and abhorred as literary runner by the more pretending of the other, I would sooner exhibit as a rope dancer. To write was necessarily to self-fashion, and such self-fashioning could be ruthlessly contested by others seeking to exert control over culture and society. While writing could be a powerful mode of self-assertion, it's also accurately seen as a source of immense personal vulnerability. Making oneself in print could lead to a shattered reputation, compromised financial affairs, and in certain vexed cases, the loss of life itself. The trope of the garret-bound writer starving due to neglect or calumny reflects the reality of a period in which the cultural power of writing was both intimately tied up with personhood and stringently policed by vested interests that could severely curtail what less fortunate authors could gain from their works. While writing was a high-stakes proposition in reputational terms, this did not prevent increasing numbers of men and women from seeking to build careers through authorship. These individuals are drawn in by the wealth, influence, and social cachet of high-profile successes, by the glorification of writing engendered through education and the periodical press, both of which were becoming increasingly accessible. However, for most aspirants, the realities of the writing life proved disappointing. Rather than being showered with wealth by publishers, they received at best modest payments, seldom sufficient to serve as a sole means of support. Rather than receiving plaudits, their works were generally passed over by a censorious and hierarchical print culture controlled by reviewers more concerned with propagating their own authority than with disinterestedly valuing knowledge or praising art. The ideal of the writer's life towards which a considerable number of talented men and women aimed commonly proved a mirage. As David Williams lamented when he explained why he founded a charitable literary fund to address the plights of struggling authors, those who believed that they could live comfortably by the pen were generally soon and miserably undeceived. It was partly to warn away potential scribblers that Isaac Disraeli published his 1812 miscellany, Calamities of Authors, in which he scrutinized the many pitfalls of literary lives by drawing on examples ranging from the age of Elizabeth through to his early 19th century contemporaries, a chronological span that he modeled principally in terms of its unfortunate continuities. From the outset, Disraeli takes great pains to contradict the impression that authors have generally been comfortable and respected. The title of author still retains its seduction among our youth and is consecrated by ages. Yet what affectionate parent would consent to see his son devote himself to his pen as a profession? The studies of a true author insulate him in society, exacting daily labours, yet he will receive but little encouragement and less remuneration. It will be found that the most successful author can obtain no equivalent for the labours of his life. Whoever labours without hope, a painful state to which authors are at length reduced, may surely be placed among the most injured class in the community. Most authors close their lives in apathy or despair, and too many live by means which few of them would not blush to describe. Throughout Calamities, Disraeli stresses that living by the pen is a chancy and precarious form of existence. It does not dispute the achievements of writers such as Alexander Pope and Samuel Johnson, who were able eventually to acquire fame, influence, and significant payments for their writings. Rather, he seeks to counteract the cultural centrality of such starry careers by marshalling a whole series of less fortunate authors, men and women who produced valuable work, but who nevertheless ended their lives impoverished, unrecognized, or prematurely. Disraeli is an enthusiastic proponent of the achievements of the marginalized writers he examines, using the term genius liberally to describe many of them. However, he contends that brilliance and innovation have never guaranteed either fortune or esteem. Instead, he argues that novel works are likely to be met at first with critical distrust and popular incomprehension, a claim that chimes with William Wordsworth's slightly later assertion that every author, as far as he is great but at the same time original, has had the task of creating the taste by which he is to be enjoyed. So it has been, so will it continue to be. Wordsworth, of course, could afford to wait, albeit impatiently, for recognition due to his non-literary incomes. Had the pen been his sole source of support, he would have been a very poor man. In 1835, he estimated that over 40 years of publishing had earned him not above 1,000. That's possibly a slight understatement made to Thomas More, but probably only a slight understatement if you go through the Longman registers and look at what Wordsworth earns. Poor remuneration for all but sensations meant that their destitution and being forced to produce hack work were common authorial fates. Disraeli reserves considerable scorn for authors who compromise their principles by accepting money to promote factions, describing them as polluters of the press who have turned a vestal into a prostitute, a grotesque race of famished buffoons or laughing assassins. Of all the writers he depicts, though, only these clients, together with a few great names mentioned fleetingly, are described as being able to realize a significant income by writing. Disraeli's gloom regarding the prospects of his contemporaries was often justified. While the productions of authors could potentially bring honour, authorship did not in itself constitute a respectable or stable profession. In part, Disraeli's formulations prefigure later snobbish divisions between creators of literary art and authors of mass market fiction. However, in later versions of authorship, both identities became to some extent viable and acceptable, albeit with different underpinning sort of financial systems. In the early 19th century, the privilege of value writing was jealously guarded by social elites, though keen to accrue for themselves the benefits of shaping opinions and spreading ideas. And this conservative paradigm militated against the acceptance of both solid professional practices and exalted artistic claims. While some critical accounts have traced the roots of authorly professionalism in the 18th century, this professionalism was usually more rhetoric than a commercial reality. As Betty Schellenberg has it, the term professional is often used in literary histories without explicit definition, but by implication simply to denote writing for financial remuneration, in opposition to the sorts of cultural and material rewards offered by coterie writing for manuscript circulation and publishing as part of a patronage system. Schellenberg is right to resist both a purely financial review of professional activity and the binary she evokes. Even in modern literary culture, patronage and coteries are entangled in complex ways of professionalism with the securing of financial rewards. And this was certainly the case in the late 18th century and the early 19th. However, I would contend that for an activity to establish itself as generally professional, a certain critical mass of practitioners must be able to support themselves financially and establish themselves socially, both individually and as a group, by virtue of their participating in it. In Disraeli's age, authorship did not comfortably answer to this description. Unlike the three great professions of divinity, law, and physic, whose burgeoning adherents Joseph Addison worried over in 1711, authors lacked a defined area of shared expertise and a strong group identity. Each of the established professions was built around access to a specialist corpus professional knowledge. Authors, by contrast, were valued for their individual particularities rather than having mastered generic skill set. Authors' practices were consequently diverse, fractious, and idiosyncratic, and they were poorly positioned to lobby cooperatively. Penelope Caulfield argues of the professions that the positions of different groups varied according to their sense of collective identity or otherwise, but also according to their bargaining power, and that in turn depended on the interaction of supply with the state of effective demand for professional services, whether that was generated by the state, by other institutions, by individual consumers, or by all of these. The collective identity of authors was weak. Their bargaining power as a group was rarely asserted. Demand for their productions was tightly constrained because literary works were generally marketed and priced as luxury items, and because a lot of people wanted to make their names through writing. Consequently, the idea of professional authorship was viewed with suspicion. It was better if one had the means to be a gentleman who wrote, with the gendered implications of that term. As Coleridge asserted when he advised in Biographia Literaria that aspirant authors should let literature be an honourable augmentation to your arms, but not constitute the coat or fill the escutcheon. This line is very similar to the way that Lamb lays out the situation in his letter to Barton, where he argues that he should use the 5 minutes of time he has before going to bed to write, and should not throw himself fully into the business of authorship. Authorship is a helpful supplement to other forms of living, but it's very risky if it is used to construe an entire identity. This situation didn't prevent some authors from agitating for respectable professional status. Schellenberg contends that during the latter half of the 18th century, some writers sought to assert the professional's claim to order a certain specialized set of skills to meet a defined need of society at large, and to be deserving of a certain status and economic rewards as a result. She also claims that this movement is evidenced in the development of institutions such as the Critical Reviews and the Royal Literary Fund, and in the increasing typology and hierarchization of forms of authorship, and in the self-consciousness of the growing prestige, most famously expressed by Samuel Johnson, and eagerly responded to by the young Frances Burney. However, by the early 19th century, such developments had failed to establish an environment within which a significant body of aspiring writers could achieve prosperity or command respect by working as authors. Views in the late 1790s, the 1800s, and the 1810s were in fact considerably less conducive to the construction of authorly professionalism than the earlier periodicals that Schellenberg examines, operating a kind of selective personalized criticism motivated primarily by extra literary factors. The Literary Fund, telling you the right to add royal to its title was not granted until 1842, was striking in that its committee and subscribers included only a handful of men who identified themselves principally as authors. David Williams persevered with the fund because he was convinced that valuable writerly achievements going unrecognized by society, the fund's success at countering this lack of recognition was distinctly limited. Literary hierarchies were instituted during this period, but many of those at the top were distinguished precisely because they were not professional authors. Lord Byron paraded his aristocracy. Samuel Rogers relied on his personal wealth. Francis Jeffrey and Walter Scott established themselves as lawyers before turning to literature. Although not with great success necessarily in their legal practice, but they had a backup professional identity. As Schellenberg and other critics such as Brian Goldberg have shown, writers certainly measured themselves against their audiences and against other professionals, but in doing so they often expressed intense anxieties about the value and status of their labour. A very small number of writers secured significant financial returns from writing. Those who did were usually underwritten, at least in part, by incomes other than their publishing profits. So he could have not lived by his pen alone. He needed other incomes to get established, and other incomes continued to underpin his prosperity. Literary writings commonly addressed elites who might support authors through patronage of increasingly diverse forms. In most cases, the audiences for books, so direct sales, were not numerous enough to provide a basis for sustaining a career. For these reasons, among others, the idea of authorship occupied a precarious position. As Dustin Griffin writes, one of the ironies of literary history is that it was probably the combination of the hard-pressed, humble 18th century authors by profession with the successful gentleman authors who made up a relatively small proportion of the authors a day that kept alive the idea that the true author was animated by genius and the goal of literary fame. Kept alive the literary fame part. I think the genius thing is probably something newer in the Romantic period, that set the stage for the appearance by the mid-19th century, the talented man or woman of letters who might lead a well-rewarded life and might aspire to be regarded as the equivalent of the members of the honourable learned professions. I would quibble with the assertion that the man or woman of letters combined authorship by profession and the demands of art writing in any kind of stable manner. We might think about Bourdieu's model of the field of cultural production here, where art writing and writing for money are kind of set against each other in various respects. But I concur with Griffin in dating the emergence of a widely recognised body of respectable professional literary writers to the mid-19th century. As Clifford Siskin notes, in 1831, only 400 census respondents classed themselves as authors, compared with 13,000 in 1901. Siskin traces in the decades leading up to the second quarter of the 19th century the formation of the consensus that allowed for this expansion, contending that Victorian professionalism had to be written up word for word before it became real and widespread. Professionalizing rhetoric, which Schellenberg and others have traced in 18th century sources, and the transformations of language that critics, including Thomas Fow and Robin Valenza, have read in Wordsworth and Coleridge, principally comprise this oppositional and contentious writing up, rather than reflecting a settled reality. It is also important to note that the fallout from the French Revolution severely disrupted attempts to constitute authorship as a reputable practice. Paul Keane has identified in the 1790s two critical transitions: a shift in focus from literature to authors and a redefinition of politics as a struggle for professional distinction rather than for national agency. The 1790s thus saw a movement from a form of criticism focused on works to one centered on writers, and the creation of an increasingly combative literary environment, which authors struggling for individual distinction often did so by condemning other writers and modes of writing. And this continuing struggle kept the value of authorship itself under destabilizing and skeptical scrutiny. While new, more respectable paradigms eventually resulted, it was not really until the 1820s that burgeoning markets and institutions allowed effective commercial and aesthetic challenges to be mounted to older models, which writing was principally the reserve of a privilege, more of a social system than a professional. A key indication of authorship's low inherent cachet in the early 19th century is the ease with which attempts at constituting literary identities were mocked by writers who operated primarily as gentlemen. In Beppo, Byron derides the idea of conceiving of oneself principally as an author. One hates an author that's all author, fellows in foolscap uniforms turned up with ink, so very anxious, clever, fine and jealous. One don't know what to say to them or think unless to puff them with a pair of bellows. Of coxcombry's worst coxcombs, even the pink are preferable to these shreds of paper, these unquenched snuffings of the midnight taper. Of these same we see several, and of others, men of the world who know the world like men, Scott, Rogers, Moore, and all the better brothers who think of something else beside the pen. But for the children of the mighty mothers, the would-be wits, and can't be gentlemen, I leave them to their daily tea is ready, smug coterie, and literary lady. So Byron here is suggesting a different continuity to that which Disraeli considers. Disraeli sees authorship as enduringly unprofitable. Byron, in figuring the persistence of the Grub Street hack and the blue stocking sycophant, figures all authorship as enduringly déclassé. Byron portrays authors as ridiculous failures, their overriding focus on bookish matters the antithesis of the diverse accomplishments required of gentlemen. For Byron, the best writing comes from well-collected masculine circles, not from literary obsession, inky-fingy diligence, or feminized salon culture. It is easy, and I think right, to take umbrage at Byron's dismissal of hard-working would-be professionals, particularly when considering his privileged social standing and the ways in which his assertions chimed with his own innovative and profitable self-fashioning. However, the prejudices he expresses were not untypical and reflected the reality that most of the highest profile writers of the early 19th century did not depend on their literary earnings. The writers Byron lists as knowing the world like men were three of the biggest selling, best connected and most acclaimed authors of the period. Of the three, only Thomas More relied principally on his pen, and his success was largely contingent on his having access to elite circles in which he promoted his poetry, performed his hugely lucrative Irish melodies, and made the contacts that allowed him to publish lucrative biographical writings during the 1820s and 1830s. If you actually look at More's career, I go into this in more detail, but it's very clear that what he's doing is getting money from the booksellers to maintain himself in high society in the hope of securing patronage, is getting the very lucrative Irish Melodies contract is almost an accident in some respects. It's not part of a sort of career plan. Walter Scott was established comfortably before he ever published, having acquired a very substantial income through his family, his legal practice, his marriage, and the patronage of the Duke of Buccleuch. Before 1800, Walter Scott already has an income of about £1,000 a year, which goes up considerably more through some very successful legal politicking. Scott does not need his literary income, although he definitely enjoys using it and indeed overusing it. Samuel Rogers, the author of The Pleasures of Memory and a pivotal figure in literary society, had a significant interest in his family's profitable bank, and after his father's death in 1793, found himself possessed of £5,000 a year. This granted him the financial muscle to publish and control his own works, a rare and potent privilege. Many other popular and respected authors lived off smaller private incomes, and patronage remained invaluable for writers without independent means. A few writers were supported directly by the state. We think of pensions as something mainly given to people in old age. Robert Southey and Thomas Campbell were both awarded government pensions of £200 a year, Campbell in his late 20s and Southey in his early 30s. Direct and indirect support from wealthy individuals also remained a factor. Examples include William Haley's support for William Blake and Charlotte Smith, Tom and Josiah Wedgwood's providing Samuel Taylor Coleridge with an annuity of £150, and Sir William Lowther's securing for Wordsworth the position of distributor of stamps for Westmoreland and Whitehaven in the Penrith district of Cumberland after registering the poet's discomfort at the idea of more direct support. So Wordsworth makes a lot more from that position than he ever makes from writing. Such incomes and the connections that acquiring and possessing them entailed granted their holders the freedom to pursue literary writing in ways denied to the aspirant commercial writers. As William St Clair has shown, while at the end of the 18th century a larger potential readership for literary works existed than 100 years before, new literary works by contemporary writers are still beyond the means of most working men and women. The small editions of 500 or 1,000 copies, which most books were printed, required a higher capital outlay and offered a relatively limited return. Savings from printing more copies were minor until you move into technologies like the steam press and stereotyping. And this, combined with the cost of storing unsold stock, meant that publishers were unwilling to gamble on longer runs until technical innovations brought down costs that really came into place during the 1820s. Kept prices high, editions small, audiences limited, and authors who depended on their works for their income generally poor. Writers who needed money were often forced to produce work at an extremely high speed. Generally, this impeded their quality of life, necessitating borrowing, thrift, and writing for long periods in poor light and circumstances. Byron's Midnight Taper was burnt at the cost of the eyesight of more than a few. The usual recourses of those who required a steady income was the production of large volumes of periodical and newspaper journalism. Periodical journalism is rising in status in this period and does eventually become probably the first form of really professional writing that supports a significant number of people. That really requires the sort of development of the first couple of decades of the 19th century to get established. The composition of novels in popular genres such as the Gothic, or authoring of textbooks or other non-fiction from mass consumption. So there are certain kinds of books that do sell very well, but they're not the kind that are going to make your name necessarily. Such low status work seldom brought literary fame, social plaudits, or vast payments. The low status of authorship was reinforced by aggressive forms of gatekeeping rhetoric that figured authorial labour as a mindless, proliferating contagion. A typical and influential example is William Gifford's attack on Robert Merry, Della Crusca, in the Baviad. Lo Della Crusca in his closet pent, he toils to give the crude conception vent, abortive thought that right and wrong confound, truth sacrificed to letters, sense to sound, false glare, incongruous images combine, and noise and nonsense clatter through the line. In Gifford's satire, Mary's toil creates only sickness and disorder. Its work is portrayed as overabundant to the point of incoherence, lacking the clarifying structure of an established form or guiding intelligence. In criticising literary labour, Gifford was on shaky ground, as his own background was modest. He'd drawn himself to attention largely through literary presentation. In the Baviad, however, he shields himself from counter-accusations by following the largely unimpeachable examples of Pope and Juvenal, by lacing his poem with scholarly notes that emphasise his classical erudition and his university education. Rather than positioning himself as a working author, Gifford assumes the mantle of the cultured gentleman in order to censure the popular success of the Dellacruscans, a largely triumphant attempt to destroy their reputation. The tax on Robert Murray eventually required him to move to the United States, an act which John Lee contends his hand was forced by financial necessity, compounded by the political context after the two acts passed into law. Gifford's Baviad is a particularly interesting example as the launching pad for a successful critical career that would soon become the editor of the influential Anti-Jacobin between 1797 and 1798, and the more enduring Quarterly Review from 1809. In both publications, Gifford pinned and endorsed virulent attacks on radical authors. The excitement provoked by the accusatory ad hominem mode he employed made that mode a key tool for all factions in an increasingly politicised reviewing culture. Gifford's Whiggish opposite number, Francis Jeffrey of the Edinburgh Review, used very similar language to the Baviad when damning Thomas More's epistles, odes and other poems, 1806, portraying More's effusions as compulsive, laborious and impure. He labours with a persistence at once ludicrous and detestable. He may be seen in every page running round the paltry circle of seductions with incredible zeal and anxiety, and stimulating his jaded fancy for new images of impurity with as much melancholy industry as ever outcast of the muses hunted for epithets or metre. Like Byron's would-be wits and can't-be gentlemen, Moore in this passage is rhetorically made all author, a ridiculous and unworthy obsessive exposed by the gaze of his stern and civic-minded judge. By diagnosing corruption in others, auditors like Jeffrey bolstered their individual and institutional claims to discernment and moral probity. This tactic remained common in later decades. In The Spirit of the Age, 1825, Hazlitt called Gifford a critic of the last age. He belies this characterization by using Gifford's own methods, describing his bête noire as being possessed of that sort of learning which is like to result from an over-anxious desire to supply the want of the first rudiments of education. That sort of wit, which is the offspring of ill humour or bodily pain, that sort of sense which arises from a spirit of contradiction and a disposition to cavil at and dispute the opinions of others, and that sort of reputation, which is the consequence of bowing to established authority and ministerial influence. Hazlitt's tit-for-tat essay enacts a rhetorical victory over Gifford, just as the Baviad enacts one over the Dellacruscans. In both works, the idea of the working author loses out. The cycle of denigration was rarely broken within the period's rancorous print culture. His review of Hazlitt's book, Blackwood's Edinburgh Magazine, attacked him in very similar terms. He seems to live in the very lowest society, for he has, for years, absolutely been on the press. As Richard Cronin wittily remarks, this leaves one wondering where the writers for Blackwood's imagined they had been. One might answer that the key position in the discourse was to be on the attack, focusing on the failings of others whilst assuming a posture of superiority oneself, forestalling questions regarding one's position by asserting a presence in better circles. Nevertheless, spectacular rhetoric could not magic away the parlous economic realities of authorship or the advantages of wealth. On his deathbed, William Hazlitt dictated to Martin Burney the following note to Francis Jeffrey: "Dear Sir, I am dying. Can you send me £10 and so consummate your many kindnesses to me?" Jeffrey sent 50, the last of a number of donations to a writer he admired, one that makes clear the stark and extreme inequalities that structured literary culture, inequalities that talent could only modestly alleviate. At the beginning of the 19th century, then, being condemned as an author rather than recognised as someone of consequence who wrote could severely limit what one could achieve by writing. Retractions and regressions from the freedoms of the 18th century have particular consequences for women whose position in literary society worsened significantly. As Elizabeth Eager has argued, the largely positive reception enjoyed by the blue stocking circle was a fleeting phenomenon. Subsequently, the cultural anxiety caused by women's very success in the public sphere of letters caused a new generation to displace women from their positions of power. The high profiles of radicals after the French Revolution lent political urgency to this conservative reaction. A major tool in the displacement of women was the aggressive and widely read criticism propagated by the anti-revolutionary press and by the party quarterlies. While women had quite often reviewed for the older reviews, particularly Joseph Johnson's Analytical, there were no female reviews for the Edinburgh or the Quarterly. The masculine circles that controlled these new reviews generally either neglected or patronized women and often lambasted female writers who ventured into political discourse. There's a further paragraph in my book looking at Letitia Barbauld. Some very popular writers like Lady Morgan were able to make light of theoretical texts using audience admiration as a shield against critical malignity. However, while acquiring a large readership became easier as the century progressed, these were exceptions rather than the rule. Those with the privileges of a Lady Morgan were few and far between. Most authors could only aspire to such popularity. Instead, grim failures were common, as attested to by the extensive records of the Literary Fund, which received applications from nearly 700 distressed authors between 1790 and 1830, including 247 individuals now considered important enough to be included in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography. We might also compare that 700 to that total of 400 authors that on the 1831 census. Writers often protested their embarrassment at having to apply, but apply they did, and in large numbers, testament to the fleeting nature of literary rewards. Common in these letters are fates of writers like William Henry Hall, an unfortunate, it may be added, undone gentleman whose once by his literary productions an ornament to society, whose bodily afflictions and whose poverty have driven him to the last state of human sorrow and wretchedness in an obscure garret on a dying bed. Lady Frances Chambers wrote in 1802 on behalf of Charlotte Lennox, author of the Female Quixote, who was in great distress of the common necessities of life and is too ill and now too old to assist herself in any way. One of the risks of selling your copyrights is that they do not sustain you. Certain authors like Southey make careful use of half profits arrangements to keep some sort of income going. A lot of writers have to keep writing or just stop getting any kind of income. The young Thomas Love Peacock, later to become Lamb's fellow labourer in the East India House, was profoundly depressed by the failure of his early works, causing his friend Edward Hookham to write that, "I have been most intimately acquainted with Mr. Peacock for 6 years, and not unfrequently during that period I have had but too just reason to dread that the fate of Chatterton might be that of Peacock. This inference I have drawn not only from the distressed state of mind in which I have seen him, but likewise from the tone of despondency which breathes throughout as many of his letters to me." William Jerden, the editor and part owner of the Literary Gazette and a Literary Fund committee member from 1817, spent a good part of his 4-volume autobiography bemoaning the inconsistency of his own relatively successful career, stressing the uncertainties that plague even well-connected authors. In one of a number of tragic examples from his work for the fund, he describes how he found in a single apartment a broker's man in possession of an execution for rent, a dead child of 2 or 3 years of age on a rug in the corner, a living mother and a living baby on a semblance of the bed, covered with a horsecloth on the floor, and the literary man, who really have written some creditable productions, sitting stupefied like an impersonation of apathy on a broken chair. And Jerden does intervene directly in a number of Literary Fund cases, so while this does sound a little bit like a description of Hogarth's plight of the distressed author, I think it probably does draw on the realities the Literary Fund was observing. Shortly after this, in his autobiography, Jerden directly quotes Lamb's exclamation to Barton as a warning to aspirant authors: "Throw yourself rather, my dear sir, from the Tarpeian rock, slash down headlong upon iron spikes." To weigh against the Morgans, Scotts and Byrons, profitably absurd authorial selves, are hundreds whom the dream of making a respectable living as an author curdled into nightmares of poverty, neglect, opprobrium and despair. So knowing these things about authorship, I think, helps us understand why Charles Lamb managed his career as he did. Lacking the kinds of independence incomes many of his friends possessed, so Wordsworth's inheritance or Coleridge's money from the Wedgwoods or from other sources, he knew that trying to live solely by literary profits was unlikely to be sustainable. It is possible that he had some hopes of Charles Lloyd, whose family could potentially have underwritten Lamb as the Wedgwoods did Coleridge. Lloyd, after all, had paid Coleridge a fairly substantial yearly sum of £80 for instruction early in their relationship. However, Lamb doesn't really seem to be gesturing towards that in surviving letters. They give no indication that he thought of Lloyd as a potential patron rather than a friend and collaborator. Reading the early Lamb, I'd really concur with Felicity James's view that the register of friendship is crucial. Lamb, knowing the social and financial difficulty of being all author, instead pursued authorship as a willing part of a coterie group, a mode that suited the time available to him around his work at the India House, which was well suited to a relatively small and tightly networked literary scene. Geoffrey Cox and Tim Fulford have both written excellent accounts of the effectiveness of coterie formations in this period. Building such networks of support was crucial for building productive literary I've written career here, but perhaps more kind of mode of sociability or form of success. This is true in strictly mercenary terms. The public support of friends could directly influence work's wider receptions. And so he hoped when he wrote in an 1808 letter, "Puff me, Coleridge, if you love me, puff a couple of hundreds into my pocket." However, coterie formations were also important for sustaining writers by reassuring that they were valued both as authors and as people. We can see the slippage between writerly and personal support most easily in correspondence. For this, I'm going to look briefly at a letter not from Lamb, but about him, a letter from his friend Matilda Beetham to their mutual friend George Dyer. In this 1810 letter, Beetham just demonstrates that she is comfortable at home in a self-consciously literary society. "I have seen the Holcrofts, Mr. Montague and Mr. Lamb. Miss Lamb did not return to town with him." George Dyer, a close friend of the Lambs, would have known that this tactful reference to Mary signified having been confined due to recurrence of a debilitating mental illness. The inclusion of such personal information indicates the extent to which networks of authors are constituted as companionable groups rather than as professional circles. Beetham confirms the importance of personal sociability and added postscript. "Since I wrote the above, a large party of us have been down to Purfleet to a ball on board my brother's ship. Mr. Lamb, though he did not dance as one, and very much contributed to making the passage there and back, the latter we were becalmed and were from 9 in the morning till 8 at night returning, pleasant to us all. We wished you to have been with us. It was the prettiest night I ever saw." Beetham goes on to describe the party, the glowing Chinese lanterns, the Hampton Orchestra, flags festooning the baffled Chinese sailors, who in their best attire and with countenances full of surprise and pleasure beheld us all dancing and seemed mightily amused. Through this description, she draws Dyer into a party that he was unable to attend, giving him something of the occasion and of herself by sharing her perspective. In describing Lamb's presence and good humour, she reassures Dyer that Lamb is being cared for and is bearing up despite his trying circumstances. In Beetham's friendships, as in those of many of her contemporaries, writing was an aspect of a broader conviviality, serving to communicate affection as well as profundities. It's a mistake to read writerly friendship solely as bookish endeavours directed towards making art in the sense we figure it now. As writing is never solely about the process of creation, rather it is woven into the tapestry of living. While we can only read the written remnants of relationships, we must take it as read there is more to them than what survives in texts. It's very clear from his letters, his co-publishing practices, and from the social connections it created. It's very clear from his letters, co-publishing practices, and the content of his works that Lamb, like many authors of his age, valued writing for the social connections and opportunities that created. Lamb, in fact, was perhaps particularly suited to a small circle paradigm, its facility for brief works, animating puns, sentimental conviviality, and essayistic conceits and ironies. This is not to say that Lamb never entertained the idea of potentially securing wealth through his creativity. There was one particular form of literary writing that could potentially garner large profits, writing a successful play for one of the London theatres. This was something Wordsworth gestured towards unsuccessfully with the Borderers, and that Coleridge tried with delayed success when he wrote Osorio in 1797. When revised as Remorse and performed at Drury Lane in 1813 with a prologue by Lamb, it became Coleridge's most profitable production. Lamb, of course, loved the theatre, so it is unsurprising that playwriting was something he would attempt. This tragedy John Woodville failed to make it to the stage, rejected by John Philip Kemble. He had better luck with his farce Mr. H, which was accepted for production. Lamb was keenly aware that if his play succeeded, it could have a transformative effect on his prospects. The run-up to the farce's first performance, he wrote to Thomas Manning that "I shall get £200 from the theatre if Mr. H has a good run," reaching perhaps the 3rd or 6th nights, the first couple of authors' nights. "And I hope £100 for the copyright. Nothing if it fails, and there never was a more ticklish thing. The whole depends on the manner in which the name is brought out, which I value myself on as a chef d'oeuvre." Lamb's assessment of the potential of a successful play was accurate. You can make a lot of money from the theatre if you are lucky. But unfortunately for him, theatre audiences could be harsh judges even when carefully managed. Reporting on the first night to Wordsworth, Lamb makes clear that while the performance started well, things went rapidly downhill. "Mr. H came out last night and failed. I had many fears. The subject was not substantial enough. John Bull must have solider fare than a letter. We are pretty stout about it, have had plenty of condoling friends, but after all, we had rather it should have succeeded. You will see the prologue in most of the morning papers. It was received with such shouts as I have never witnessed to a prologue. It was attempted to be encored. How hard, a thing I did merely as a task because it was wanted, set no great store by, and Mr. H. The quantity of friends we had in the house, my brother and I being in public office, etc., was astonishing. They yielded at last to a few hissers. 100 hisses. Damn the word, I write it like kisses. How different. 100 hisses outweigh 1,000 claps. The former come more directly from the heart. Well, 'tis withdrawn, and there is an end. After the performance of Mr. H, Lamb's friends in the audience, at the performance of Mr. H, Lamb's friends in the audience proved insufficient to boost the play to a third night, by which Lamb might directly have profited. However, while it is clear from the letter that Lamb was pretty downcast about his fast's fate, there's also a sense that some of the edge has been taken off by the actions of his friends. Even the duty of writing to Wordsworth becomes a chance to try for a more successful kind of writerly performance in the assonance of hisses and kisses and the careful counterweightings of the final paragraph. Lamb's talent for drama had not been proven, his talent for sociable connections let him keep his literary muscles limber. His secure work at the East India House meant that while the failure stung, it was not ruinous for him in a way that it would have been for someone who had banked on a theatrical payout to keep their career on track. In my book, I talk about an Edinburgh writer called Robert Heron, who does try and live purely by the pen and pins his hope on a play which is booed off the stage. And that does, in fact, ruin him in many respects. If I had more time, I could talk about other works of Lamb's to fill out a picture of the ways he employed his particular forms of creativity, discussing his collaborative writing for children in works like Tales from Shakespeare and Mrs. Leicester's School, thinking about how he planned to make his specimens of the English dramatic poets who lived about the time of Shakespeare yield employment and money in the end, and considering the 1818 works in the context of Michael Gamer's work on self-canonization. However, I've rambled on for long enough. It seems fitting to conclude with Lamb's great successes with the Elian essays, a form of success that was catalyzed by changing publication environments, by long practice, and by Lamb's particular networks and talents. In my early discussion, I alluded to the power of and success of the Edinburgh and Quarterly reviews in mediating literary culture. The sales and reputations of these reviews allowed the high-paying model they established eventually to become more widespread in the periodical marketplace, raising the status of the periodical writer. Conversely, the dominance of their juridical voices triggered counter-reactions in the second wave romantic magazines, which sought to employ the fascinations of character against the anonymized power of the reviewerly cliques. You might think particularly of Blackwood's as the innovator. Lamb had been working and experimenting with the form of the periodical essay throughout the 1810s, but at the dawn of the 1820s, a space opened up where he could take advantage of the kinds of voicings he'd been practicing in the various short forms he had essayed over the past 25 years, blending his strange erudition with his playful social manner, his talent for layered irony. The London magazine gave him a platform to stage iterations of his coterie forged manner to a wide audience, finally making his name through the stratagem of taking on someone else's. One way of reading the first Elian essay, or one of the first Elian essays, Oxford in the Vacation, would be to see it as a space where Lamb thinks through alternative lives he might have had. At the beginning of the essay, this can be seen as seeking to play the gentleman, enact the student. As the essay develops, the contrast is drawn between Lamb and one of his friends, George Dyer, who we mentioned earlier. In the 1823 essays of Elian, this passage is a rather benign pen portrait. This is because Lamb excised two sharp-edged paragraphs that appeared in the original London magazine version. In the second of these, we can again see Lamb praising the career of author and implicitly rejecting it for himself in favour of a more Coleridgean vision of writing as an augmentation to arms. Dee has been underworking for himself ever since, drudging at low rates for unappreciating booksellers, wasting his fine erudition in silent corrections of the classics, and those unostentatious but solid services to learning which commonly fall to the lot of laborious scholars who have not the heart to sell themselves to the best advantage. He has published poems which do not sell because their character is inobtrusive, like his own, and because he has been too much absorbed in ancient literature to know what the popular mark in poetry is, even if he could have hit it. And therefore his verses are properly what he terms them: crotchets, voluntaries, odes to liberty and spring, effusions, little tributes and offerings, left behind him upon tables and window seats parting from friends' houses, all the inns of hospitality where he is courteously or but tolerably received in his pilgrimage. His muse of kindness halt a little behind the strong lines in fashion in this excitement and craving age. His prose is the best of the sort in the world. It's a faithful transcript of his own healthy, natural mind and cheerful, innocent tone of conversation. You might think how some of this sounds a lot like the way that Lamb might have been described before he puts on the lion's mask. We return here to the question of character, something that in Lamb's view, both Dyer's temperament and his working conditions prevented him from establishing in the consciousnesses of the audiences and appraisers of literary work. By contrast, in Elian, Lamb had finally found a way to make his own character obtrusive, an opportunity granted by the social connections his relative comfort had allowed him to foster. Dyer, in constant service to the booksellers, had never found the space to stage the kind of social style that would sustain. Supported by his company salary and pension, Lamb lived in relatively gentlemanly fashion, died with a small fortune saved, unlike Hazlitt, and became, with the paradigms of literary judgment slowly morphed, one of the most beloved authors of the Victorian age. Dyer, however, applied repeatedly to the literary fund, as did Honor Dyer after his death. His cheerful, innocent tone of conversation, always quiet, faded quickly from the literary landscape. And I will leave drawing the moral from that, if there is one, to the questions. Thank you very much for listening. We'll stop the screen share now.
Thank you so much, Matt. Thanks. A fantastic talk. I loved it. And we're all applauding. They will thank you properly at the end. But I just wanted to respond to that by saying how wonderful it is to think about Lamb's comments to Bernard Barton in that longer context, and to have an insight into the broader argument of your book, but also that very special insight into Lamb's attitude to authorship and how it evolves over the course of his career as well, I think. I love that closing thought of him thinking through alternative lives in the Elian essays. I think that's so true, and how he might have developed as an author if things had gone differently, or if he'd stayed working as a clerk in the South Sea House. I also love the little insights and sort of suggestive comments about, well, did he think of Lloyd as a potential patron? Was that perhaps there at the start of their friendship? And also the speculation about Mary Lamb, perhaps, and her role as an author. What did it mean to her to be an author? Well, I'm sure we're going to open up some of those questions in the discussion now, because we have got a bit of time. Thank you very much, Matt, for generously agreeing to answer some questions. Do we want to open it up now to questions? And if anybody has one, would you mind just either raising your hand using the Zoom function, or just put it in the chat for me to flag up that you've got a question to ask. I think maybe because I can see, I think Greg's got his hand up first. Greg.
Hello. Yeah, thanks so much, Matt. Very nice to see you again after a long absence as well.
Yes, nice to see you. You've grown a really magnificent moustache since I last
saw you. I'll give you a twiddle. There you go. I frighten my children with that. They don't like that at all. Yeah, I was just going to ask you about, really looking forward to getting to know your book, but did you have the opportunity over the course of your research to do sort of any kind of comparative study in this respect with other European literary cultures, perhaps? Or not? I'm fine if not, but I just think...
sort of mainly, mainly if not, although I think the sort of the technological sort of stuff I think is relatively flat. In fact, in some ways, the cheap print takes off in Britain before it takes off elsewhere. The systems are quite different in some other European countries. So there's the sort of we touched on this a little bit in the book that I have just been co-editing with John. Nicole Pohl has a really interesting chapter on the Musenhofs, the sort of court salons in, but expanding out from court salons to other kinds of practices in Germany. But if we think about sort of people like Goethe, he's employed as an administrator, not as an author. So he's definitely known as a great author, but is employed elsewhere. I think that's true of quite a lot of figures in quite a lot of places. And if you, there is some more sort of contrastive stuff, and I look through a sort of series of careers of people who applied to the literary fund, looking at what went wrong for them, or rather what advantages they lacked in starting out in some cases, and look at how a few people. So there's a sort of a more involved close reading of Southey's career and Thomas More's career and Scott's career in the book. I also look at Hannah More and Felicia Hemans to look at the very particular disadvantages that women labour under. Felicia Hemans does make real efforts to build a career, but the total earnings for her whole career are the same as Thomas More gets paid for one poem at one point. There really is a very strong gender division in what literary work is perceived to be worth. Not so much actually in the Literary Fund awards, but very much in the market. But I think you could probably take some of the material about technology in the book out to other European contexts, but you would need to be quite careful thinking about different kinds of system, the far more sort of centralized French system of academies. Somebody's always moaning about the lack of a British academy, which of course doesn't get founded until the early 20th century. There are different kinds of employment for writers in universities. The publishing industries work slightly differently in different countries. So I think generally you would not see authors being underpinned by pure literary profits in most countries until you get into the 19th century, but the systems of support for them would probably have a certain amount of national variation there. So my findings from which are pretty much Britain would not be universally applicable. I hope that sort of helps.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah, thank you very much indeed. And thanks again for today. It's been great.
Thanks, Greg. And now we have Rick and Jane who are waiting to ask a question. Rick, do you want to go first?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Matthew. That was really great. Excuse me. One thing I was interested in was how long it took you to use the word journalism or journalist as distinct from author. And then you made it very clear that you saw the rise of periodical literature really only taking off in the 1820s on a large scale. And this would explain why the people you were discussing were in a different category. What I was thinking of, though, was whether, given that there were newspapers, sporting journals, and this kind of thing, you know very well, in Pierce Egan, I mean, if you think of Egan himself, is there a different sort of model there on which you could build a literary career, starting just in a more popular kind of journalism, even if it was more limited than it became later, and through that eventually turn to something more substantial that might then become called authorship?
I think that's still very difficult. I think it's possible to a certain respect. Of course, people do get regular payments from newspapers and periodicals, and those are very good for the people who have them. So, like when Southey has the sort of poetry column, and Mary Robinson has the poetry column. I'm trying to think, is it the Morning Post? That is a sort of, they like that as a sort of steady income. I think, though, that sort of journalistic regular work would be the kind of thing that would be seen as sort of all authorship in the model that I'm painting. So it would perhaps militate against your making your name in certain kinds of circles unless you have other means of establishing yourself. I guess someone who does that to a certain extent would be Hazlitt, who sort of begins trying to make his name with his philosophy, doesn't really sort of take off as fully as he would like, so then becomes a parliamentary reporter for a while, and that provides his income. But I think what he gets there is access to certain kinds of networks, some of which he has ins with already, but those sorts of things gets him access to a culture he can then comment on but that's happening in those sort of newer form magazines like The Examiner and the other periodicals that come in, then spins out successful book-length volumes from that. But I mean, I did also have Hazlitt in there, and he dies with very little to his account. So he can live like that, and people do live like that. But you're not building up your like comfortable multi-100-pound pension of the kind that Charles Lamb does. You have to keep writing there. You're usually selling your copyrights rather than accruing our profits arrangements. So yes, it's possible, but it's very hard to stop, and it's very hard to save in those sorts of situations, is the sense that I have. I mean, I quoted William Jerden there, who is a literary journalist, principally, and a very successful one with the Literary Gazette, but Jerden goes bankrupt at the end of his career as well. There are reasons for that might relate to his sort of personal misdeeds. People who produce enormous amounts of work in those forms are sort of running into severe trouble well into the Victorian period, like later people like John Abraham Harrow, who try and launch themselves as poets and then become mainly periodical reviewers. They very commonly applying to the literary fund in the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s. So I think it's always pretty ropey. It's not impossible, but often if you prod into people's backgrounds, you'll find that many of the people who seem to establish themselves most comfortably are getting money from elsewhere rather than direct publishers' profits or direct profits from journalism or those sorts of things.
Right, thank you.
Thanks, Jane.
Hi, thanks Felicity. Hi Matt, such an interesting talk. I can't wait to read your book. I have a very specific question, and it's just really asking you to expand on your use of the term sentimental conviviality in relation to Lamb and in relation to authors of the period more generally.
I've sort of got a chapter on that in the book, which was originally the last chapter in the thesis, which I got very good advice should move earlier. So the book begins with a chapter on the financial situation and then moves through this sort of notion of sort of conviviality and sentimentality. Because I mean, the question really is if the models of art, sort of making literary art that we keep now are not as sharp in the Romantic period. I don't think they're completely absent, but they're not the sort of the Wordsworthian model or the Shelleyan model of art are not really taken up fully in this period. They're being written into being oppositionally. And if you can't like become a professional author and it be a comfortable career in being a professional doctor or professional lawyering, what's authorship doing? And I think what it mainly is doing is making your name to a fairly influential group of people who will read those kinds of writings and with whom you will form convivial connections. Those people might be able to do things for you in pragmatic ways, but they're also the people you want to sort of build a kind of social ethos with. And that social ethos, I think, is really a dominant social ethos. Bourdieu, in his later field of cultural production, calls authors the dominated part of the dominant class. I think in this period, authors who are successful are really part of the dominant class, no clarifiers in some ways. And that sort of kind of conviviality is the sort of legacy of 18th century sensibility as it's transforming through conviviality and the other terms that have been sort of explored in works like Russell and Hewitt's Romantic Sociability and sort of interesting forms like Ian Neal's book on the Romantic Tavern. The authorship is sort of far more an outgrowth of people's personalities and personal modes of self-expression than I think we would think of it being later on. And I think Lamb is a very successful author on those terms, and that I think he's not particularly, he doesn't find writing like sustained tracts particularly comfortable. It strikes me that when we were speaking just before this sort of meeting about David's point, he was talking about how he could have easily read a lot more of the Elian reading by jumping between incidents. There was another bit that he wanted to get to. And I think Lamb's best writing often does read like that, a series of bits rather than the sort of brilliant little fragments that connect together. Think of the ways some of the Elian essays read. It seems to be developing a lot more out of that sort of convivial conversational thing than like the structured plan for a history or some other kinds of books. So I think there is a literary mode that comes out of that kind of conviviality, that comes out of conversation and comes out of the kinds of social performance in conversation. In that second chapter of the book, I spend quite a lot of time talking about the immortal dinner and the sort of way that acts as a staging of people being authorly, and perhaps more authorly than actual authors can be, by acting in certain ways in Haydn's company, and then Haydn recording that in those sorts of personal correspondence, and then of course that material getting published, circulated later on. I can't work out whether I've answered your question or veered completely off the subject.
You have answered it in a roundabout way, I think. I understand what you're saying, and yeah, I appreciate your answer. At the same time, I'm wondering whether you could just abandon the word sentiment and what work sentiment is doing there. I think I could probably answer the question pretty much in the terms that you've just answered it, actually. But I was just quite curious to discover whether you're using sentimentality in a specific and precise sense.
I think I'm probably not using it in a particularly specific and precise sense, but rather as part of that broader mode of social self-fashioning of authors that is part of a sort of term of kind of words of social connection that I think play a really strong role in sort of the mutuality of authorship in a way that, like the Wordsworthian model of the poet and the reader, where the poet is considerably above doesn't. And that mode of author and reader being very separate, I think, becomes more of a thing once you get a huger audience in the second quarter of the 19th century, once you get English authors being taught in schools as authorities and those sorts of things. And it's just sort of seems to be less present in lots of earlier kinds of sociable formations, and the precise fashion for what that kind of connective material is called changes at various points. But I think it's there in a lot of earlier social formations. One of the things that we miss when we anthologize things and take them out and put them as authorities, I think. And perhaps it's right that we could consider older things that would not have been seen precisely as we think of art being as art now. We don't have to read all early 19th century work solely with an early 19th century mindset, but I think there are some interesting mindsets that we can recover that suggest some quite different reading practices, both in what the text does, but also how the text operates as a mode of connection between people.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, perfect.
Thanks. I know Judith is waiting with a question too, but I just wanted to come in there actually, and I was just wondering, sorry Judith, I'm just interfering. But I was just wondering whether that sentiment question did have something to do with your discussion of Charles Lloyd. And you said, well, actually, you didn't think that it could have been a patronage relationship because, and I think it's something to do with that idea of sentiment or feeling, that is a factor in their literary relationship and in their concept of authorship, which sort of then dies down a little bit, but which Coleridge makes great play of in the Nehemiah Higginbottom sonnet. And that's a sort of sentimental aspect of conviviality.
Yeah, I'm not going to sort of, you know far more about this, so I think that's probably a better statement than I could give. I mean, I do think that like sentimentality can be tied up quite tightly with patronage relationships, and that it is this sort of these kind of sentimental dedications are often the payment for patronage of various kinds. Like Wordsworth does acquire quite close relationships with the Beaumonts, but that is also a patronage and a financial relationship in some ways. And likewise, sort of, it's clear Haley quite wants to live in like close cahoots with Blake, and that Blake is a lot more less comfortable with that. And that's one of the reasons why that patronage relationship doesn't quite bridge and sustain.
Yeah. In a way, maybe the payment to Lloyd is the sentiment. But Judith, sorry, I've come in and interrupted your question. Would you like to?
Yes, okay. Yes, sure. Well, first of all, I would say I'm a proud possessor of this great book, and
you should be after tolerating supervising it as a PhD for so long.
No, and I want to ask a question which I think is related to some of the things you're discussing with Jane there, not on the sentiment question, but on the issue of value. And I know that you do this with more precision in the book, in the thesis and in the book. So I wanted to give you a chance to draw it out. The difference between the kind of monetary value, the income. You're detailing quite a lot in your talk how much people are earning and the relative incomes of different authors, especially the differences between male and female authors. And you had that really distressing image from William Jerdan of the sort of absolute abject poverty, so that we know that there are authors, so the value is coming to authors through their the cash income, the absolute need to earn money. But you're also talking about bourgeois and cultural value. And I'd like you to sort of to separate those out a little bit more, and to think a bit more about and then also thinking about the sentimental, the affective might be a useful term as well. There's relationships of friendships between the sort of the horizontal circles and networks, but also the sort of the vertical social relationships. So there's a value to being an author that is distinct from the monetary value, as well as that sometimes you get that note of self-pity in authors' letters. I'm not paid enough for what I think is my actual cultural worth. So it's sort of more of a topic. Can you expand on and also make some more distinctions, which I know that you do in your writing?
Yeah, I mean, I think the sort of the book started about how, so where does, in some ways, a very crude question, like where does authors' money come from? How do they? Why would you write? And I think it's sort of, or how would you support yourself while you were being a writer? So those two like interconnected issues, and it becomes very clear that not very many people are making a lot of money directly by writing in this period in a way that you might sort of see in the Victorian period, or you might see today with certain forms of commercial writing. And so a lot of what you're doing is building a, if you were writing, is you might get some direct money, which might be useful to you in a particular moment. There are people who do sort of write novels very fast and then sell the copyrights. In the book I talk particularly about Eliza Parsons, who does this, who I'm very fond of, but also has to write, I think she writes 51 volumes of novels in 13 years, and that's barely enough to support her 8 children. And she ends up like sort of constantly in debt and with all sorts. She write an enormous amount and make very, very little money from it. So what you're sort of, so what you're trying to do, I think, if you're trying to sort of make yourself valued as an author, is use your writing to make your name so that you can move into a society of sort of influencers in some ways. You can become part of a larger cultural system and shift values. And in some ways, that system will then sustain you to a certain extent. So Coleridge never makes all that much money from any of his productions, but he does sort of string along through things like the Wedgwood annuity, through getting the Malta Post, which he gets because people think he's a very smart person. Lloyd pays him because he's known to be a very smart person. So while Coleridge is not making a lot of money from publishing, he's making a name for himself as one of the smartest men of his age. And that sort of lets him, despite his sort of own personal problems, string together something. And some people who are rather more careful managers of their own affairs, like Southey, do a more stable version of that, although perhaps one that we find slightly less exciting nowadays. I think one of the interesting things about the Romantic period is the people who were selling well and were seen as the most successful at the time kind of slipped out of view, and we now name it for quite a controversial subset of writers within the period. So there's that sort of weird slippage. So in that sense, like, financial value and cultural value. I think we might sort of have a kind of art value and a commercial value for writing. I think both of those in this period sit under a broader umbrella of kind of a social value among networks of readers, and it only sort of slowly diverges into art value and sort of cash value. Not that those are necessarily directly opposed as you move through. But you're still, I think, in some ways, you could boil down the whole book to be that all that stuff about Johnson saying that patronage is broken when the dictionary comes around is rubbish, and that you're getting a more diverse form of patronage arrangements moving into the period, including the patronage of people like journal editors and institutional directors. Thomas Bernard inviting Coleridge to lecture, of course, but patronage remains very important right through and remains really of paramount importance in various different forms until you get into the 20s and 30s and or something more resembling a true age of mass print. Does that sort of vaguely?
Yes, it does. I wonder if I could ask a follow-up question about then the value of writing to Lamb, and that you demonstrated that clearly he couldn't make a living through it, but he still valued it as an activity. So what value do you think writing had for him?
It's the thing that keeps him in the good opinion of his friends, and that he sees keeping him in the good opinion of his friends. It's like it keeps him. It acts as an effective mode of self-expression. It makes him feel that he can change the world. It does those things that writing does for all us, where we feel we can effectively communicate and effect some sort of change, even if we're not really in one of the person or in a small circle, by communicating. So I think one of Lamb's sort of brilliant things is he learns eventually to bring that sense out to a mass audience in the Elian essay. So it still feels like Lamb is talking to you in quite a personal way. I think it's one of the things that people enjoy about Elian, and that it's not the sort of anonymized we of the Jeffrey judging periodical voice that has been sort of dominant in both the Quarterly and the Edinburgh as a sort of paradigm in literary culture through the previous few decades, that it is this sort of more personal voice that becomes something as the sort of notions of genius begin to sharpen up, as sort of the direct connections of people in literary circles become wider, so that people have been afraid of the mass reading audience since the 1790s, but once you get into the 1820s, it's finally beginning to be there for the sort of people, literary writers of various kinds, and that changes the modes of mediation. And Lamb is in some ways very effective at papering over that form of change by still being able to transfer these older modes of coterie sociability, of sort of discussion into the very modern context of the London magazine and its peers. I'm still really only thinking about this. The sort of Lamb stuff in this has been written mainly in the past couple of weeks, and I hope to expand on it at some point. So Felicity and other more expert lines do jump in on this and sort of contradict me if I am saying something ridiculous about Lamb. But that would be my sense.
Right. Yeah, it's my sense too, Matt. I think you brought it out so well in that talk, and just there, that sense of the coterie, the friendship that expands into print.
I think that's true of the Romantic poets in general. They're writing of the people we now think of as the dominant forms of the poetry, they're writing in these quite carefully sustained social circles. So Wordsworth and Coleridge and Byron and Shelley all have old privilege in some ways. Keats is a slightly different case, and Blake is a very different case, but they're able to operate in these older social networks. They're not super successful in that older social paradigm. They're nowhere near as effective performers as people like Thomas More are, for example. And one of my favorite Thomas More anecdotes is from late in his life when he's playing the piano at the Hunts and singing, and someone asks Wordsworth whether he's enjoyed it, and Wordsworth says, "It's very pretty, but it's not poetry, is it, Mr. Moore?" And Thomas More, being a nicer man than Wordsworth is in social contexts, is of course not Mr. Wordsworth. But that sort of sense that Wordsworth is in a position where he can write a new version of poetry, and then it can get taken up by these new periodicals who are seeking to build up this sort of model of character, and that becomes established precisely at the time also when older value systems are looking about how they're going to communicate in a new world of mass print. And then at that point, Wordsworth's kind of propositions of the press-lyrical buzz stop being threatening and become, okay, this is how we can manage mass readerships. The poet still has an authority here, even if they are now speaking to a larger audience. So there's a sense that they're sort of fortunate in their existing privilege, and they're also fortunate at living in this transition point where they get to be the last writers of an old golden age as a new mass culture is emerging, to be held up as kind of the representatives of that older age and its advantages, or the best of it in some ways, in a way that perhaps they would not have been seen as directly in 1800s, 1810s.
I can see Greg's got his hand up, and I'm just going to say, so let's think about a couple of last, so I think we've got time for a last question or two. And Greg, I'd love to hear your response to this.
Hello, hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm unsure of my technology. That was fantastic, Matt. It was really amazing. It's such a magisterial overview. It's an incredible sort of sweep and accuracy. It was really. I mean, I'm familiar with some of your work before, but it is amazing. I suppose it's a sort of question, and I thought the way you described that sort of transition, what Lamb is doing with the kind of Elian persona as a sort of, private, amiable, familiar voice that then, gets set in a commercial context and frees him up, and, gains its audience. I thought seems absolutely right to me. The only thing I had to add really was just that letter that you quoted at the beginning, where he's writing to Barton about booksellers, as far as I can tell, and you can correct me on this, he's really thinking about one specific person. So I mean, he's writing as if he's had this terrible experience across many years. My sense of it is that he hadn't really. But that what has happened is that Robert Baldwin, when he commissioned him to write the Elias with, with John Scott as editor, he began by paying Lamb really rather well. He was the highest paid contributor, which, I suppose raises a question: why would it be him? Why would he? What's that about? And then when Taylor and Hesse took over the magazine in the spring of 1821, Baldwin failed to pay Lamb what he owed him from, as it were, the last 6 months. So Lamb there's an unpublished letter actually in Princeton, I think, where Lamb writes to Baldwin saying, and gives him an absolute inventory of all the essays he's written and saying, this is what you owe me. And it's a few months later, he's writing to Baldwin about the awfulness of booksellers. And it seems like it's a very specific complaint he has. And also, it's a very specific complaint he has. And apart from that, I'm not sure Lamb had a particularly bad experience. But the question, if there is a question, was just that, do you have any light to shed on the fact that Lamb, when he moves into becoming a commercial author for the magazine, is paid higher than everybody else suddenly, and then, as it were, very quickly embittered by that whole experience, if we're to believe that letter of Barton?
I suspect he's paid a lot because he has made a name for himself doing essays in the Examiner and other forms. Previously, he's established, and also he's known to the people who run the magazines through these sort of social connections he's building up. And there's also this horrible thing that they know Lamb doesn't need the money. He's got a very high salary from the East India House at that point. So to induce him, they may have had to offer him a fairly substantial sum. You do get this sort of nasty thing where payment is based on perceived social status. So when the Wedgwoods give Coleridge an annuity to live on, they give him that's supposed to really underpin it. They give him £150. When the Duke of Grafton gives Robert Bloomfield an annuity that's supposed to underpin it, he gives him £15, so a tenth as much. I think generally I would agree with you that the sharp practice among booksellers gets overstated, and authors love moaning about it in various ways. I think you're almost certainly right that Lamb is thinking about this particular unpleasant experience with Baldwin, so probably is particularly angry in this window, and that lots of writers build up quite sort of close relationships with booksellers. But I think there is always this sort of kind of a grieved sense in authors that they're not being paid as much as they think their productions are worth, and they could be doing something more profitable, although it's actually really hard in sort of practice to see what that would be because of the sort of the scale of the literary marketplace. They think, possibly because they're getting feedback through their friends and these sorts of things, they get that sort of system is working well for persuading authors that they're wonderful, and they're looking at the money they're getting thinking this isn't enough. But that really is in most cases what the market will bear. There's some really interesting stuff with Southey, and Southey works very effectively with Murray. Murray's a really good promoter of Southey, but Southey gets really angry at Murray and pulls gentlemanly status on him at various points. He calls him Murray Main, like Charlemagne, for thinking that he's overclaiming. And there is this sort of gentleman trade thing that gets called up at number points. There's done in the Moore dispute with about Byron's memoirs, that Byron actually calls Murray out. I'm willing to accord you the privileges of a gentleman, Mr. Murray, which means if you are a gentleman, you will fight me about this. But there is this sort of complex kind of social arrangement. I think actually, and there are some booksellers who employ sharp practice, but I think generally it's sort of authors not really realizing that the costs of printing are so high, and that sort of cavilling at the sort of arrangements available to them. So often authors will be paid quite considerably later than the publication. So the copyright, you either sell your copyright, in which case you get money immediately, but then no recourse to anything else if your publication does well, or you get paid under the half profits arrangement where there has to be some profits to pay you. So Longman pays out its half profits in June every year. So even if your book sells out very fast, it might be 9 or 10 months after it's printed before you see anything. And it could be 2 or 3 years or never before you see any profits. So I think there is a real sort of, the financial underpinnings, the direct financial underpinnings are really not good in this period. And so I think that resentment gets pushed onto the publishers. Perhaps unfairly.
Could I ask you a more general question, which is a kind of methodological question, I suppose, which I think well on top of. But I mean, it comes out of, you know, Margot Finn's Culture of Credit book. Because I mean, what's wonderful about that book is the way she talks about, you know, the fact that because of, you know, practically everybody had a cash flow problem in the early 19th century. Everybody's in debt, and everybody's in debt to each other. That, I mean, and it's just to do with the way that as it were, the private economy works, and in the way that bank accounts work in those days, and the way that how and when people get paid. How does that work for you methodologically? I mean, that helps explain in some ways why authors, like a lot of other people, are constantly in debt and constantly in hock to other people and so on. Does it mean that you have to qualify your sense of their hardship or their destitution, their struggle, if you like, if in fact it's a historical condition that doesn't just affect authors? Or is it, you know, is it something that you can use but have to be wary of?
I use the Finn book quite a lot because I think the stuff about credit being corresponding to known quantities of character is really important in this. I think, I mean, there is still the fact that I think you do have to be aware of the kinds of economies operating at the time, but it's still very clear that for authors, the slowness of publishers' payments are a huge problem. And I think your access to that form of credit does depend very much on social status. So again, you're disadvantaged if you're working class or a woman in that sort of situation. Sally can probably borrow money fairly comfortably. Eliza Parsons cannot borrow money easily, and maintaining her character is very important. She does in fact get thrown into debtor's prison later in her life. Happens to Robert Heron, very nearly happens to many of the sort of other writers have. So I think you're still relying to, while that system is true, it is a system that doesn't like cut across social divides, that you still have access to more credit if you are wealthier and have wealthier friends yourself and can play a fuller role in that economy, can lend and borrow to a greater extent. And the debtors' prisons are a pretty serious risk. I mean, there are writers who write their way out of debt. Once the publishers know you don't have any money, then they do not have to pay you as much. And not all publishers are going to enforce that brutally, but certain publishers, and particularly the publishers who write as seen as hacks, writers who have not successfully built eminent social positions for themselves through writing, the publishers that they will have to deal with will often be quite ruthless in sort of knowing that someone needs the money and will pay the copyright. So you will get your immediate needs seen to, but the publisher will then own your work and be able to sell it to circulating libraries. If it does do well, keep it as stock, trade it as stock within the publishing industry, which is a sort of slightly unpleasant conjurer monopoly at this point, and has all sorts of weird trading to anti-competitive practices. There's a lovely letter from Murray to Blackwood that I quote quite extensively in the book that lays out the systems by which publishers avoid competing with each other to keep prices high and markets effective for their purposes.
Thanks. Thank you, Matt. What a nice discussion to finish off with. John, I know you've been waiting with a question for a long time too. So I'm going to come to you now to conclude.
Okay, a very, very quick question, because we've asked quite a lot of you, Matt, but that's testimony to how wonderful that paper is. You know, those of us who teach in the university are, I guess, more like Charles Lamb or William Wordsworth. You know, we don't have to work, you know, in the tax office or in the India House, but we're not motivated by, you know, the value of writing academically is not necessarily financial. I mean, you might not write the money, except for, you might get you a big chair in the end, of course. So maybe there are. But I'm just interested in your take as an academic author, and what analogies you see between writing in the university in the 21st century and those people 200 years ago. And this is on my mind because I've just read Anthony Holden's brilliant autobiography, and he laments the day in 1968 when he got a second from Oxford and he realized that his dreams of being an academic were gone. He'd have to go off and be deputy editor of the Sunday Times and meet Jean-Paul Sartre and Ronald Reagan and Mrs. Thatcher instead. But he still has it in for a little bit for academics, because he sees the modern academic as more like the gentleman scholar or the gentleman poet or author from the early 19th century, who has, who has a kind of pretty leisurely career, and then occasionally every 5 years writes a book that sells 40 copies if they're lucky. This is a Holdenian affectionate caricature, but I'm very interested on your take in terms of the value of academic writing and what analogies you saw.
I think that actually the analogies are quite strong in many respects. That yeah, sort of if you think about in academics, once you have your permanent job, it's quite well paid, and that is your main source of income. The money you get for your books is fairly minimal, but then publishing those books will get you sort of promotions and build your reputation in the academic community you're working in, and that's the thing that's likely to improve your situation and standing. And that is actually quite like publishing in the Romantic period in some respects, as to sort of detriment of the academic system is the sort of the body of people who do not have permanent academic posts and are trying to break in and are doing lots of very poorly remunerated work. So there are not enough posts for the people who want them, in the same way as there are not enough sort of positions for people, that there's only so many spaces for named authors to be visible in the literary environment of the Romantic period. So a lot more people try than can possibly succeed in making a name or securing a post. The institutional patronage through universities is different in some ways from the less formal, in some ways still rather sort of aristocratically inflected systems that are there in the Romantic period. But I think certain kinds of things about the importance of building reputations, about the importance of networking, can be carried across, possibly slightly disturbingly easily. That would be my...
Thank you very much, Matt. Okay, let's finish up as ever with the parish notices, and our next event is a big one, our annual general meeting, followed by a lecture by Felicity, which I'm sure will be outstanding, and it draws on her editorial labours on the lambs for OUP. From chapbooks to classics, the children's literature of Charles and Mary Lamb. Some of you may have this in your diary for Saturday, the 21st of May, but just to give you notice that we've had to put the date back by 2 weeks to Saturday, the 4th of June at the same time, 2 p.m. So make a note of that occasion, and I think it's going to be an afternoon to remember. So we'll see many of you there. So thank you very much, Felicity. Thank you, David. And thanks most of all to Matt for a wonderful paper. Thank you very much. Great stuff.
If I listen. Thanks again.
See you next time, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. Wonderful talk.